Thank you very much, and thank you for your warm welcome. It's lovely to be with you. It's a bit of a surprise to you, probably as well as me, but thank you very much for having me. I'm not going to keep you for very long this morning. I'm not entirely sure what your series has been. I was given this passage, so that's what I'm going to speak on. It's just a few thoughts from the passage that we had read to us so well this morning. If you've been in church for a while, you might have heard those verses before. And we often call them the Great Commission. So the idea is that Jesus was giving his disciples and then all of us his instructions for what to do in the world, to transform the world into the place that God would like it to be. And sometimes with passages that we might be quite familiar with, we skip to the bits that we know without looking at all the bits that are around it. And this has sometimes been called the lullaby effect. The idea that we don't really think about what we're talking about or what we're reading, it just sort of gently rocks us off. And if we really stopped to think about the words in most lullabies, rockabye baby is not necessarily the best words. So the idea that the lullaby effect happens with Bible passages that we might get really familiar with, and that's probably the same thing that might have happened to you when you heard these words this morning. But as I was preparing, the things that really struck me were all the things that are around the bits that Jesus said to the disciples. And so in order to understand what's going on in this passage in Matthew 28, we're going to have to skip back a little bit in the story. So Jesus was born. I'm not going to skip that far back, don't worry. And then he lives, and then he dies, and then he comes back to life again. And at the beginning of this chapter, in chapter 28, Mary and Mary go to see the place where Jesus was. Instead, Jesus isn't there. There's an angel. And the angel says, look, this is where he was. And then in verse 7, and I'm reading from Tom Wright's translation, the angel says to Mary, go at once, tell his disciples that he's been raised from the dead and that he's going on ahead of you to Galilee. That's where you'll see him. So they go, and then just a few verses later, Mary and Mary see Jesus, and this is what he says, and this is verse 10. Don't be afraid, said Jesus to them. Go and tell my brothers that they should go to Galilee. Tell them they'll see me there. And that's where our story in verse 16 picks up, with the 11 disciples going off to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had instructed them to go. So those verses in Matthew tells us that it was 11 of them, so no Judas, but Peter and Thomas were there as well. But Galilee isn't just a few minutes up the road. They were given these instructions in Jerusalem, and it's kind of 60 to 80 miles north they would have had to travel to get to this place where they're going to go and see Jesus. And the area that the disciples would have walked through would have held so many memories for them. If they had gone right out of Jerusalem, then they would have gone through Bethany, where Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead and where Mary and Martha lived. They may well, towards the end of their journey, have passed by that mountain where, at the beginning of Matthew, Jesus gave his famous talks that we know of as the Sermon on the Mount. They might have passed another important mountain that Matthew tells us about, at the event where Jesus shows us something of who he is in what we call the Transfiguration. They may well have walked around the Sea of Galilee, which again would have held so many memories for the disciples, where they'd seen Jesus calm a storm, where they'd seen Jesus walk on water, where they and Jesus had crossed in boats so many times. While they travelled all that way from Jerusalem to Galilee, I wonder what they talked about. I wonder how they were feeling on that 60 or 80 or even longer, depends in Galilee where they went to. How were they feeling on that journey? Now, they clearly believed that they'd been given good information from the Marys that led them to go up for that journey. But I wonder whether, late at night on their own, whether any of the disciples actually were really questioning that trip. Maybe not out loud, but quietly in their heads, as they stopped for another night, were they thinking, what are we doing? We left Jesus in Jerusalem, and we're going all of this way. But there, when they got there, on the mountain, it says in the passage we read this morning, they saw Jesus with their own eyes. And then Jesus tells them that they will be the ones to show Jesus to the rest of the world. That their role in the world, that our role in the world, is to show other people who Jesus is. And that journey got me thinking, really. I wonder what sort of journey you've been on recently in your faith. I don't know if you might been feeling a bit like you don't really know where you're heading. You think you're on the way, but maybe you're feeling a little bit lost. I reckon some of the disciples felt like that. Maybe you're a bit unsure about the path that you're on. You thought it was something that God had told you to do, but he's been a bit quiet lately. And deep down, you're starting to have a few doubts about that journey. Maybe you're on that journey, but you're looking up at that mountain, thinking you're just never going to get up there. Perhaps it's a financial mountain. Things are really tough at the moment, aren't they? You're just not really sure whether God's with you in that. Perhaps you're looking up at a mountain of illness or problems in your relationships, people that you love, but that relationship is really starting to show the strain. Maybe you've been on a journey that's walking away from the last place that you saw Jesus. Maybe you're just feeling a little bit lost. And I reckon there were times when those disciples felt this huge range of different emotions, but they went. And when they got to the mountain and got up the mountain, they saw Jesus with their own eyes. And there's hope for you too, whatever journey you've been on lately. Wherever you are, just take a moment and look around. Look at the signs that surround you of God's care. Like the disciples on that journey, remember the times that things have happened in your life, the reminders of ways that he's helped you in the past, the ways that God has provided for you, the friends and support that he's put around you. Look for the stories where Jesus has shown you something of who he really is. Don't give up, not yet. Keep on that journey. Get up that mountain and see Jesus again. And it's not easy to do this when we feel like we're on our own. I don't want to make it sound like I've got this all sorted, because I definitely haven't. And while I was preparing, I remembered the words of a friend of mine who came through several really bad bouts of very severe postnatal depression. And there were times when she felt like she was just hanging on by her fingernails. I don't know if you also know that feeling. I do, of just hanging on to my faith by my fingernails, not knowing whether you'll make it through. She did make it through, and several years ago I wanted to use her story in church, so I emailed her to make sure that it was all right, and she wrote these words to me. I don't feel I've got great faith, but I have faith in a great God. I actually feel that in the long run, going through such deep depression has strengthened my faith, because I've seen God at work in me and in other people, though I couldn't see any of it at the time. Everything that my husband and friends did was God-led, was God working through them to help me. I remember one day feeling as if living with depression was like trying to climb a huge mountain. And naturally you want the mountain gone. But I felt that God was saying to me, I know you'd like me to flatten the mountain, but instead, I'll climb the mountain with you. Because when you get to the top, you will see that the view is beautiful. Now maybe you're in a situation like that this morning. Hang in there. Because when you get to the top, you will see that the view is beautiful. When the disciples got to the top, their view was Jesus. Jesus, who then promised to be with them to the very end of the age. Every single day, Tom Wright says, to the very end of the age. Cling on to that promise. Jesus is with you every single day. And there's another point in this passage that is actually one of my favourite details in all of the Gospels. It's there. They're at the end of this journey, even on the mountaintop. This point appears alongside the risen Lord Jesus, and it's something that means none of us that are left out. Verse 17 tells us that they saw Jesus and worshipped him, though some hesitated, or it says some doubted. And it's such an incredible detail. If I was writing this story, there's no way I would put that in. I wouldn't want people to think that there were people there doubting. I just wouldn't want it recorded. And I wouldn't have wanted my introduction this morning to have been, we want to welcome Sarah Jane as our speaker. Most of us think she'll be okay, but there's a few of us who just wonder why she gets invited back. And I'm not claiming to be Jesus in this, but what a weird detail for Matthew to put in this story. Why would he say that some of them hesitated or doubted? Now, we don't know what they're doubting about. Maybe it might be hesitating to worship Jesus because as good Jews, they would only worship God. Maybe they're doubting that it really is Jesus. It doesn't say in the text. But the fact that it's in there, I think, is really important. I don't know if you're the sort of person that hesitates or ever has doubts. I definitely am. I can be really unsure at times about my faith, about God, about God's plan for me, about the journey that I'm on. But our doubts, our hesitancy, doesn't exclude us from God using us. The very next verse, verse 18, says Jesus came towards them and addressed them, all of them. And then he says those words that we might be familiar with about going into all the world to make disciples, to baptize them and to teach them everything Jesus commanded. But who is Jesus giving that commission to? To everybody that's there, to those that believed and to those that doubted. Jesus understands that we all go through periods of doubt sometimes. He understands that, but he tells you to get on with it. Don't let your feelings of unworthiness get in the way of the plan that Jesus has for you, that God has for you. These verses are for you as well. God doesn't reject you because you've only got a little bit of faith. God doesn't tell you that you can't be part of his plans because sometimes you doubt. God doesn't leave you alone because he thinks that you're not cut out for the job. I have had this book on my shelf for a really long time, Struggling to Believe by Dave Burke. It's an excellent book. And in there he says, God is not like the glossy hostess of a cocktail party, all the while moving on to something more interesting. And I don't know if you've ever had that experience of talking to someone and all the time that person's looking over your shoulder at the person that they really want to speak to. That's what he's saying by this. God is not that person. Jesus didn't see the doubt of the disciples and think, I'm not going to involve them, but I'm going to involve these people because they're more spiritual. Jesus doesn't move on to someone that's more worthy, more interesting, or more committed. Jesus saw them hesitate, and he included them. And he said they were to tell the world about Jesus. And more than that, he saw their doubt, and then he said, I'm not going to leave you. And through Jesus' words there, we can be confident that Jesus is not going to leave us. You are called. You are loved. And you might have to start today with worship for Jesus, for who he is, for what he's done for us, and for how he chooses us. Another quote from this book. We are setting out on a lifelong journey. In the course of our travels, our character will be transformed. The final result will be beautiful beyond description because we will resemble the Lord Jesus Christ himself. He will travel with us. Sometimes we will feel his presence, but other times he will travel incognito and we will not sense his nearness. Yet here is the Almighty Being who designed and built the universe, inviting you to come and know him personally. And it's not always easy. The disciples had certainly already seen that, and they would continue to see that as they tried to live out these instructions. They'd been with Jesus for 3 years, and they still didn't always get the point. They made mistakes right the way through. But to them, Jesus gave this important role. So whether you're on the journey, wondering what on earth you're heading towards, or looking up at the mountain, wondering if you're ever going to make it up there, or even standing really near to Jesus, but still feeling that doubt. He's with you. He accepts you. He walks alongside you, and he wants to reassure you that when you get there, the view will be beautiful.